Well, as you can see, we've got quite an agenda today, and joining me in the studio this lunchtime is political commentator Lettice Bromovsky. Lettice, a week is an awful long time in politics, and Rishi's had his feet under the table at number 10, what, for one day less than a week.
Yeah, completely.
What do you make of his work so far?
I would say the general consensus so far is that this first week has gone well, but there's no denying that this is the sort of honeymoon stage of his premiership. And essentially, people will be looking at this. He's saying a lot of words at the moment, but it's the actions that people are waiting to see. We can see, like you said, the polls, they've taken a jump this week. There are those immediate things you can see. Also, the pound is very strong at the moment, 1.16 against the dollar, so that's doing very well. But there have also been these sudden U-turns and his cabinet reshuffle, which has a lot of people a bit confused, perhaps, because it didn't change much from the previous prime ministership of Liz Truss. And there are people in there that I'm not quite sure how they've managed to get into the cabinet. Nadhim Zahawi, in particular. This was a man who actually took Rishi's job back in the summer, quite notoriously went in when Boris Johnson's sinking ship was going down, and then literally just last weekend was very publicly backing Boris Johnson again. But as soon as Boris backed out of that race, he very quickly turned around again and stuck his flag on the mast of Rishi Sunak. I think that's particularly untrustworthy.
But that's politics, isn't it?
It is.
You want to back a winner.
Well, completely. And as you're saying earlier with Suella Braverman, we're exactly seeing these political games at play again. I think the appointment of Suella Braverman is entirely a strategic one, to try and bring together, or at least have representatives from all these different factions of the Conservative parties around Rishi Sunak.
But I mean, why did he have to choose her? I mean, he obviously doesn't want to prove that he's in hock to the far right of the party. There were other people on the far right he could have chosen. And I see on the front page of the newspaper today, Rishi Sunak is facing growing calls to sack the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, before purging the party of the influence of Boris Johnson and right-wing supporters.
I think that's using a bit of a hyperbolic language, I would say. I don't think that Rishi is going to sack her. I mean, he's only just appointed the woman. Yeah. I do see why there would be some tensions. This is our Home Secretary, the woman who is meant to be looking after our country, security, the police force. And the Times actually released an article last week that said this isn't the first time she's been caught sending personal emails from her personal email address, and in fact, she also did it when she was the Attorney General. Yeah. I think it's particularly embarrassing for her that MI5 is stepping in to give her a lesson on how to handle her briefing documents.
But there's also a question as to whether or not MI5 feel that they can trust her.
Yes,
they have come out. Position for a Home Secretary to be in.
Completely. It's the wrong image to be putting out there. They have said that they do trust her, what level that is. The fact of the matter is they have to trust her. She is the Home Secretary going forward. And I think that one of the reasons she has been appointed is she's quite tough, and a lot of the Conservative voters quite like that. The Rwanda plan, although I don't think that's the right direction or the direction they'll be going in anymore, too much time, too much money, too much opposition, when actually now they're looking towards the general election and they need to win those votes. However, we see on the front page of the Times a new deal coming forward, talking with France. This is where we need to be. This is entirely the right area that we want to be in. The real way we can stop this is through proper communication, and that's where Liz Truss was so bad.
It is brilliant, actually, isn't it? Because apparently Sunak has already been talking to Macron, and they've got a very good relationship going.
Exactly, and we only have to cast our minds back a mere few weeks when Liz Truss was in the leadership contest, and she said, so embarrassingly, she was asked a question by someone, Emmanuel Macron, friend or foe, I think was the question, and she said, oh, the jury's still out. You know, all the laughs, all the laughs. But this isn't funny. No. This is real people's lives of those people who are crossing this channel to get here. This is our country our services having to deal with what's expected to be around 40,000 people coming in by the end of the year. Like, we can't handle this, and I think the solution's much closer than we think.
We're going to be talking about it a little bit later in the programme. But the other bear trap that he's fallen into is saying he's not going to go to COP27 and he's not going to let the king go either. Do you think he's made a mistake there?
No, I don't. I think it's the right decision for him not to go. We have the autumn budget, which has been pushed back from this Monday to the 17th of November. COP27 runs from the 6th of November to the 18th of November. He needs to be here in the UK planning around this, helping Jeremy Hunt, his Chancellor, push forward on this, how we're going to fill this £50 billion black hole. And although COP27 is a wonderful event and I support it, this isn't the first time a Prime Minister hasn't gone. And in fact, in Labour's 13 years when they were ruling over this country, one of their Prime Ministers only went once. So it's not as shocking. I think it's a bit of a storm in a teacup. And with Charles isn't Prince Charles anymore. He is now King Charles. And one of the moves when he transitioned from that role, from Prince to King, was that he would take a step back from politics, essentially. He wouldn't keep putting his foot in it, like he did with the Rwanda plan, actually. And he would, and the same, I think COP is a very political event, you know, environmental policy, that's politics, and I think it's right that he's not there.
But he could always do a zoom into it, couldn't he?
Well, yeah, he definitely could. But again, I think it's just best that
step back.
Yeah, he's got too much going on, and I think a Zoom, I mean, we've all been on Zoom over COVID, but the real things, the real changes happen when you're in a room together, you have proper conversation, there's no lags or Wi-Fi problems or whatever issues you might have. The real change happens when you get together in a room.
Now, you were not a Rishi Sunak fan. You did not back him, did you?
Not at all.
Very briefly, have you changed your opinion?
No, not yet. I'm not 100% not against him. I was 100% against Boris Johnson coming in. And so, frankly, we are in a situation where he is not as divisive as Boris Johnson and he's not as impulsive as Liz Truss. There's no doubt that I think he can do well, and maybe he is the unity and the safe figure we need. But, you know, he's got to prove himself.
Jury's still out then, Lettice.
Yeah, the jury's still out. Exactly.
Well, political commentator Lettice Bromovsky there, and she's going to stay with me, actually, and she'll be back a little bit later in the programme. But thanks, Alice. Well, Lettice Bromovsky is still with me here in the studio to discuss all the politics at home as Rishi Sunak's first week as Prime Minister has come to an end. In the programme tomorrow, Lettice, we're going to be taking a look at the in-tray that Sunak's got. He's going to have to deal with, let's say, he's going to have to deal with the unions, with the NHS, with pensions, with energy. I mean, it's such a massive amount that he's got to deal with. Is it too much for him to cope with? I mean, is he going to have to cut back on things?
Well, I mean, like we were discussing earlier, he's already cut back on things like not going to COP. He's staying at home. He's very much focusing on that. Already this week, we've seen a few sort of U-turns, if you want to call them that, on fracking, for example. He's reinstated the ban on fracking. That is just going back to the manifesto in 2019. However, it is changing what back from Liz Truss. It's just sort of turning it on its head, and it is creating a few of those tensions. But he's trying to get a few things off his plate just to start with. I would say in his in-tray at the moment, the focus should be and must be on this energy crisis and the cost of living. We've been very lucky at the moment. The weather hasn't been too bad. People haven't had to really necessarily turn their heating too much. But that's going to all change very quickly, and people will immediately start struggling again.
But he's also got the unions to deal with. I mean, you say that he's got to deal with the cost of living, but for instance, not only are the trains going to keep going out on strike, or the train workers, but he's got the nurses' strike coming up, and there's a big problem, isn't there, labelled NHS.
Yes, there is a huge problem labelled NHS, and all of these areas, I would say, need reform. Think about the railways for a moment. People don't use the railways in the same way that we did before the pandemic. People just are not travelling to work as much. They don't need to commute. We've got this very flexible way of working. And so having these trains running all the time with no passengers on them is just not sustainable either. So there needs to be reform there. The NHS, there is no doubt that needs to be reformed. And I'm sure what we're going to see a lot of in this autumn budget, mini budget, whatever you want to call it, is these public spending cuts in these areas and entering into this stage of austerity, as it is being called at the moment.
But it's a very difficult line, isn't it? Because if he puts income tax up by too much, if he cuts by too much in public spending, people are going to say, no, we can't stand that. So he's not, well, he and Jeremy Hunt, they've got a very, very, very fine line before they actually drop off the cliff one side or the other, haven't they?
They've got a very fine line, and not only a fine line there, but also in the politics that's going on in the party. I think one thing that Bob Seeley, your guest you had on a moment ago, said, which I thought was so interesting, was this idea of all these different voices in the party. It's not the communist Unionist party. This is the Conservative Party. And although there are variations in these voices, that's where you get the best policies, that's where you get the best ideas from. They're variations around the same foundation of thought. And I think that that needs to be utilised so much more. There are areas that he's looking at, like expanding of the windfall tax. We know that Shell this week, you know, they said that they had made profits of 8 billion on a 30 billion profits for the year alone, and yet they hadn't paid anything in windfall tax.
But most of that profit, as they've said, is made abroad and not actually in this country. And the profit that they do have is what they're ploughing back into infrastructure, which is why they've avoided paying that tax up until now.
Well, exactly, but they are willing. The CEO came out and said that they're happy to pay a bit of income tax because they're making so much of this money, and they're happy to put it back into a sort of, happy is probably the wrong word here, but they're willing to contribute to a society so that maybe people aren't struggling so much.
Is that an answer, do you think, that perhaps we've had the wrong approach to big business where it comes to taxing them more on their profits, and that it takes somebody like Rishi Sunak, who after all was the Chancellor of the Exchequer and understands money, going in and saying, actually, rather like Shell, we need your money, please give it up willingly?
I would say it's a very fine line. Like we're saying, we do not want to start overtaxing these companies so they start moving abroad, because they've got the money, they've got the resources, they've probably got companies in other places where they can just move their locations to, move their factories to.
And not pay any tax at all.
And not pay any tax at all. And so that's the very fine line that they'll have to negotiate with these companies very seriously going forward.
But he has got to sort out the unions, he's got to sort out the nurses, hasn't he? I mean, it was all very well, that lovely 77-year-old lady yesterday saying...
That was very sweet. And she's now on the front pages somewhere.
You're not paying them
I know,
enough.
exactly.
She's right.
No, well, she is right. But again, everyone would love a pay rise in these times. And it's very difficult. You can't just be giving out money left, right and centre when we've got so many financial issues to deal with. And I think he did handle that situation quite well, you know. It's sort of every politician's nightmare to be called out live while you're sort of doing these runarounds. But
especially by an elderly lady.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like being told off by your mother.
Yeah.
But I do think it was so important that he's doing this and he's showing face and he's going around to these places. Boris Johnson, for all the communicator that he was, for all those characteristics, he wasn't really a man of the people, and you didn't see him walking around. Liz Truss was just not a communicator at all. Whereas Rishi's back out there talking to the people that matter. He's in these hospitals. I think it was the hospital in Croydon, talking to these people. And I think that is a first step. And it's very good that we've got a communicator like that back in place.
How much of a problem is his individual wealth going to be?
I think that it will never not go away. I think it'll be a conversation throughout his premiership. But I think
let's face it, Richie, you know, the opposition is they're not cheap either. Keir Starmer is not
exactly
not short of a bob, is he?
not even a little bit.
No.
And so I think it'll just always be one of those sore spots to press on. I don't think it's going to go much further. He has married very well, and he's also worked to earn his money. It's not like he's just inherited this from a very wealthy father somewhere. He knows what hard work is, and I think that that's important in this role.
It's very interesting, isn't it, that we've got Rishi Sunak now as the Prime Minister at his second attempt, as it were. We've got Jeremy Hunt, who failed against Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
Both of them desperately wanting to be Prime Minister. But actually, who would want to be a Prime Minister?
I couldn't agree with that more.
All of these problems.
You've got so many problems. Also, it's the most thankless job out there. They are constantly torn down by the media, constantly torn down by the opposition. There seems to be no part of the job in which you would want to be in that. And I think that that's something we've really, really got to change going forward. We want our MPs to be the people going out there who really want to be in the job, not people having it as a second or third job, not people doing it when they're older because, you know, they've lived their life, they've earned their money, and now they want to give back. We want more young people going into these jobs, getting it from the get-go, and desiring to be a Prime Minister, because I think that's where you get the best Prime Ministers from, people who want to change it and have a desire to change it. But the media, the frenzy that's always around them, it's brutal, and it's unfair a lot of the time, I think.
We're going on now to talk about the situation in Northern Ireland. Now, as a political political commentator. What is your take, before I talk to Kate Hoey and Emma Little-Pengelly about this, what is your take on the situation that's happening there? Can you see the game?
I completely sympathise with them. I think that the end game is that the protocol must be amended. We can do tinkering, for example. There should not be checks on goods moving between the UK and Northern Ireland. Those goods that are destined just for Northern Ireland rather than going further afield, that should be completely got rid of.
I mean, the basic problem is the government is saying, or the EU is saying, we don't trust you to put things into Northern Ireland and then not ship them over the border into the south.
Well, also, why should Northern Ireland trust Westminster? Why should they trust the British government here? I mean, we had Boris Johnson, who came out outright and said, over my dead body would we ever put a border in the Irish Sea. And look where we are today.
There it is.
And then you've got Liz Truss as well, who came out swinging, and that, I think, might have scared the EU a little bit, saying that she would change the rules, not break international law, but allow UK to unilaterally change these rules. And, well, she didn't last very long, so she wasn't able to implement that. So who knows where Rishi Sunak is going to go on this, but they need stability and they need confidence in the government.
Thank you for that, Lettice, because I am now about to talk. That was political commentator Lettice Bromovsky, but